China and its fears about Starlink, developing a plan to destroy Starlink. UN report, Chinese regime sends weapons to Myanmar's junta to attack civilians. Senkaku dispute, China-Japan inaugurate long-awaited hotline to prevent conflict from escalating. Global Times commentator heavily criticized for mocking former British Prime Minister Liz Truss. Recently in China, criticism directed at Elon Musk, the founder of SpaceX, has increased significantly after two Starlink satellites approached dangerously near the Chinese space station last year. Starlink was crucial to the Ukrainian war effort. Satellite links have allowed soldiers to communicate, identify targets, and upload videos for the world to see. That capability heightens China's concerns about Taiwan, the self-governing island China claims as its own. If Taiwan could access Starlink, it would make a Chinese invasion more difficult. But China's concerns doesn't stop there. Beijing fears that through Starlink, the U.S. will gobble up territory in low Earth orbits. China also wants to become a great power in this area. And the fear of being left behind by the U.S. in the space war also makes China want to develop a system similar to Starlink quickly. Thus, a new Chinese race has begun. Chinese military develops new anti-satellite capabilities. China plans to develop many ground-based laser imaging devices to photograph orbiting satellites at millimeter resolution. China has also demonstrated the ability to destroy satellites with rockets. Still, this method can generate a large amount of space debris, and the cost would be too high for a system consisting of many small satellites with relatively low fees. The Starlink constellation forms a decentralized system. Therefore, the focus is not on individual satellites, but the whole system, requiring China to develop low-cost, highly effective measures. According to public information, China has been developing many alternative anti-satellite technologies, including microwaves that could interfere with communications or burn electric components. Chinese scientists have also developed lasers to dazzle or damage satellites, nanosatellites that can be launched in large numbers to paralyze larger satellites, and cyber weapons to penetrate satellite communications networks. A space scientist in Beijing recently called for an attack on Starlink from China. That's not entirely a surprise, given the growing tensions between China and the United States. Cut the rope. Analysts noted that if China wants to invade Taiwan, it could start by cutting off 14 undersea internet cables that connect the island to the world. So now, Taiwan is adding cables and planning to protect their landing spots. The country also tests antennas in 700 locations, including several outside Taiwan. They can send and receive signals using low-orbit satellites like Starlink's one. Zhang Yuso of the Institute for Defense and Security Studies, a think tank in Taiwan, says the goal is to make the antenna as mobile as possible to survive an attack. China can shoot down satellites, but with more than 2,300 satellites and counting in orbit, Starlink is often thought to be indestructible because the system can maintain normal operations after the loss of several satellites. China may consider leaning on Elon Musk to deny Taiwan access to Starlink. Musk's other company, Tesla, has a large factory in Shanghai. Last year, he offered to give China some control over Taiwan to resolve its dispute. As a result, it is not surprising that Taiwan is looking to reduce its dependence on other countries. Its space agency needs help to develop its own low-orbit communication satellites. The first one is expected to launch in 2025. Fearful of falling behind the United States, officials in Beijing have developed a space race mentality. In April, Premier Li Qiang toured 3 startups to highlight the importance of their industries. One is Galaxy Space, the maker of satellites, 6 of which were launched in low orbit last year. Much of the recent activity stems from Xi Jinping's desire to modernize the PLA. Xi wants to create a highly informatized force that can use information technology to conduct joint operations on land, air, and sea, not to mention space networks.
Chinese and Russian entities have sent over $670 million in weapons and other arms-related equipment to Myanmar's, formerly Burma's, ruling military junta since its coup 2 years ago, helping the junta to crush opposition and retain power brutally. A United Nations report states, since the coup, the Myanmar military has imported at least $1 billion worth of arms and dual-use goods to support the military's domestic arms manufacturing. Tom Andrews, the UN Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation in Myanmar, said on May 17th that these countries still sold those weapons, despite overwhelming evidence of the Myanmar military's atrocity crimes against the people of Myanmar. After the Myanmar military took control and imprisoned democratically elected leaders, some opponents of the military regime resorted to armed resistance. In certain regions, these individuals have aligned themselves with ethnic minority insurgents. In response, the military has used airstrikes and powerful weaponry, even targeting civilian areas. Radio Free Asia reported that the Myanmar military uses these weapons in several documented atrocities, including an airstrike on a school and monastery in a village in September 2022 that killed at least 6 children. The report noted, given the widespread reporting of the Myanmar military's war crimes, China has arguably made these transfers with actual knowledge that the Myanmar military will use the fighter jets transferred by its state-owned arms manufacturers in attacks on civilians in violation of international humanitarian law. Lucas Myers, a senior associate for Southeast Asia at the Wilson Center, a Washington, D.C.-based think tank, said, the Myanmar military's relationships to Russian and Chinese arms suppliers are the backbone of the junta's combat capabilities, without which its ability to hold on to the country's center and urban areas would likely suffer substantially. The report said that Myanmar's military often uses Chinese K-8 jets and other Russian-made aircraft to conduct airstrikes against these targets. Arms transfers come in various ways, including advanced weaponry systems, fighter jet spare parts, raw materials, and manufacturing equipment to support domestic arms production. The report also found 41 Chinese state-owned and private companies contributed $267 million, while 28 Russian entities accounted for $406 million in arms sales. Earlier this month, Chinese Foreign Minister Qin Gang even hailed the friendship between the two regimes during a meeting with the junta leader.
The conflict between the Chinese and Japanese governments over the Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea is heating up rapidly. The Japanese defense minister and his Chinese counterpart inaugurated their long-awaited hotline on May 16th to prevent conflict from escalating and frontline soldiers from firing at each other. This move is to control the bilateral situation promptly and avoid additional risks. The Japanese Defense Ministry said Japanese Defense Minister Yasukazu Hamada and his Chinese counterpart Li Shangfu had a 20-minute talk on incident response channels through the hotline for the first time since it was established on March 31st. Hamada said there are disputes between Japan and China over the East China Sea and other geopolitical issues, so frank exchanges are necessary. This connection is particularly critical, especially when the relationship between both countries is on a decline. He said Japan is ready to ensure the hotline works appropriately and will continue communicating with Beijing at the defense ministry level. Beijing and Tokyo are currently embroiled in a dispute over Japanese controls Senkaku Islands. The Chinese Communist Party, CCP, continues to send Coast Guard vessels and aircraft into waters and airspace around the islands to harass Japanese ships. The Japanese military has also frequently dispatched fighter jets in response. In addition, Chinese naval fleets regularly circle the coast of Japan and sometimes conduct joint military drills with Russia, angering Tokyo. The Japanese government has publicly stated that they are increasingly concerned about escalating tensions over Taiwan and is eyeing the risk of Beijing coercing Taiwan by force. AP reported that former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and the CCP leadership proposed the hotline idea in 2018 to avoid spontaneous clashes between their two militaries. On the evening of May 16th, former British Prime Minister Liz Truss arrived in Taiwan for a 5-day visit. Taiwanese Foreign Minister Joseph Wu greeted her at the airport. It's the first time in 27 years that a former British Prime Minister has visited Taiwan since Margaret Thatcher's visit in 1996. Truss's visit angered Beijing. Global Times commentator Hu Xinjin also mocked Truss on Twitter but was heavily criticized by netizens. Truss gave a brief speech at the airport, saying she has wanted to go to Taiwan for a long time but was restricted as a member of the British government. Nevertheless, she was happy to be able to make the trip, especially at a critical time when Taiwan was facing the threat of force from China. Of course, Beijing is not happy about this. Global Times commentator Hu Xinjin harshly criticized Truss on Twitter, saying, "The shortest-serving former UK Prime Minister is going to Taiwan to make a fool of herself. She put on airs as if her words still count. Taiwan is also pitiful. It has become a museum for Western officials who stepped down and made a mediocre career. Immediately after his comment, Hu Xinjin was criticized and ridiculed by international netizens. Some commented on his post as follows: "The Taiwan Museum is open to people with good intentions to visit. Do your conditions meet the standards? According to your logic, you have also stepped down and put your heirs as if your words still count. That dude who stepped down from the Global Times laundered so much money, he sent his son to Canada to be Canadian instead of being Chinese. Yes, it is you, Hu Xinjin. For Chinese propaganda to become a prime minister is a mediocre career. Truss would serve much longer if she was the dictator like Xi. More propaganda from the Chinese experts." He said these words on the outside but was very jealous inside, saying she came to Taiwan to make a fool of herself, but China's fighter jets fly harder around Taiwan than anyone else.